Welcome to the training for the Twitter solution template. My name is Justina Lichnik, and I'm a program manager on the solution template team. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into the Twitter solution template. We're going to start with a report walkthrough to look at the output of the template and talk about how one can use the solution to analyze their Twitter data. We're then going to do a high-level overview of the architecture, and we're going to show you how you would go about setting up the solution template end-to-end. In the next section, we'll do a template deep dive. We're going to look at what the solution template has spun up, look at every component, and talk about how the solution template works together. We will then look at how you can go about customizing an existing solution. We will look at how you can go about doing things like changing the keywords, how you might go about extending the template. And finally, we'll talk about pricing at the very end. So let's go ahead and get started and do a report walkthrough and set up the solution template end-to-end.
In this example, I'm tracking the Power BI keyword from the perspective of a program manager. I want to see what is currently trending, what sorts of topics are people discussing, and what difficulties people might be experiencing. The first page gives me an overview of everything that is being tweeted out of the accounts I follow. This means tweets, responses, and retweets made by Power BI itself. I can see which outbound tweets and hashtags are trending, and I can even drill into the raw tweets. The next page gives me a similar view, but from an inbound perspective. These are all the tweets being tweeted at Power BI. And as an example, I can drill into one of the previous days and look at the inbound tweets and see what sorts of things were being tweeted at Power BI. The next page is an impressive network visual that has actually been created by Microsoft Research, who have contributed a lot of the visuals that you see in this report. As a PM, I can monitor the volume of tweets coming in across time using this time brush at the bottom. And so I can drill into, let's say, a spike of tweets that I can see right over here by just dragging. This is going to, in turn, update my network visual. And now I can go ahead and start explore it. I can go ahead and see all of the gray nodes, which are topics, and the blue nodes, which are my authors. I can see Power BI here as the center topic, and all of the authors around it are tweeting about Power BI. What's even more interesting is I can go ahead and start exploring all of the other gray nodes around me to see which other topics are people also talking about in relation to Power BI. And if I zoom out more, I can start seeing clusters of blue authors form, talking about Power BI and another topic. If I drill into one of these clusters, and I can use my text filter, I can actually go ahead and see that the topics that people are talking about is R stats. And I can click on this node to cross-filter my time filter at the bottom. And what's interesting over here is that I can actually see that over time, not many people were talking about R stats until this very point in time over here. So something interesting must have happened at this point in time. I can now go ahead and use my hashtag filter over here to drill into R and R stats, which were the two hashtags I noticed on the previous page, to see what people are actually saying in terms of the raw tweets. I can go ahead and select the time period I was interested in, much like before. And as I start exploring the raw tweets themselves, I can actually see that Power BI service now supports R visuals. So this was an update that Power BI did where it now supported the creation of R visualizations inside the Power BI service. I can see some additional statistics around this, such as, let's say, the number of unique tweets, as well as that the sentiment is generally neutral or positive. As time goes by, I will probably want to continue monitoring these hashtags and see if any negative sentiment ends up creeping in due to things like potential bugs. I now navigate to a page dedicated to sentiment. On the left-hand side, I can see graphs showing the average sentiment of a tweet aggregated by author or a hashtag below. I also get an additional dimension, which is the count of tweets. This is important to me as I might be worried about an author who consistently authors moderately negative tweets, a lot more than an author who may author a one-off negative tweet. Luckily, in my case, I can see a lot of consistent positive authors and very few negative authors. I can quickly identify negative tweets, though, and drill into them and quickly identify bugs users may have hit. And as a PM, I can immediately respond to make sure that the problems being addressed have been resolved. Finally, I can use another very interesting Microsoft Research visual, the table sorter, to find my most impactful tweets. After choosing a number of variables that define impact for me, such as sentiment, the number of retweets, and the number of followers, I can stack these variables to show me the tweets with the largest impact. I can even go ahead and reweight variables, and I can give certain things more impact. So if sentiment is something very important to me, I can go ahead and give it a weighting of 4. And when I press OK, my table sorter will go ahead and update to reflect the most impactful tweets based on this new condition that I defined.
That concludes the report walkthrough. What we're going to do now is actually set up the solution template end-to-end. And in order to do that, we start out on the Power BI website. You'll notice a Solutions tab, and we can go ahead and navigate to Solution Templates right over here. This takes us to the landing page for our solution templates. You will see all the solution templates we've released so far, but today we're going to focus on campaign and brand management for Twitter right over here. On this page, you'll notice a View Report button. When I go ahead and click this actually takes me to an embedded Power BI report straight here inside the browser. What I can actually go ahead and do is interact with the same report that you just saw me demoing a minute ago. So you can go ahead and go on the Power BI website and see this report and play around with it yourself to get very familiar with it and get familiar with the story. What we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and actually set up the solution template. We're going to go ahead and click on Install Now. This is going to take me to the web-based installer that we use to set up solution templates. And the first thing to notice is this architecture diagram. This architecture diagram tells us what components of the solution template we actually set up through the installer. Over here, this is the logo of Twitter because obviously we're pulling data from Twitter. In order to pull this data, we use something called a logic app, and we spin this up on a user's Azure subscription. The logic app goes and queries Twitter and gets back any tweets that it finds with the relevant search terms. It then pushes it into something called an Azure Function, which we also spin up on a user subscription. The Azure Function does a number of enrichments on top of the data. It does things like sentiment analysis, and it actually does sentiment analysis by calling cognitive APIs behind the scenes. And we will go into a lot more detail throughout the training into this. It also does things like it enriches the data with tweet direction. Finally, all of the data is written into Azure SQL. We then have our predefined Power BI reports, which you already saw me demoing, and these are the same reports that someone would get when they would set up the solution template from scratch. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we need to do in this experience is connect to an Azure account. We have a choice of either using an organizational account or using a personal account. In this case, we're going to go and use an organizational account. And now I need to actually connect to Azure. This is going to redirect me to an OAuth page where I can put in my credentials and connect. And the reason that we need to do this is we need to basically sign in as a user so that we are able to spin up Azure resources on behalf of that user. So here I'm signing in as myself, and I'm basically giving this application or this installer permission to spin up Azure resources on Justina's Azure subscription. We return you a list of all the subscriptions that you have access to. I'm going to choose Power BI Solution Template Development. In the advanced option, we allow you to actually change the Azure resource group name if you would like. So I'm going to name this Training Video Twitter. And we also ask users to tick a box to acknowledge the fact that this is a paid service. The template itself is free, but all the Azure resources we're going to be spinning up will contribute towards Azure consumption. So we just need a user to acknowledge that, and they can learn more about pricing by navigating to our documentation. When I click Next, this is going to take a couple of seconds. And the reason for this delay is because we're actually spinning up a resource group right here at this point in time. And this resource group is going to be the container that basically we're going to put all of the Azure resources that we spin up into. The next page allows us to connect to a SQL database. And we have two options over here. We can either spin up a new Azure SQL instance right here inside the browser, or I can go ahead and actually use an existing SQL instance. In this case, I'm going to use an existing SQL instance, and I'm going to put in my credentials over here.
For this particular template, we only allow a user to utilize Azure SQL, so you cannot bring your data into an on-prem SQL server. So this is going to take another few seconds. It's just going to go and find that SQL instance, and it's going to return me all the databases I have write access to for that SQL instance. And right now, this has gone ahead and done that, and I can navigate down and actually see all the databases that I have access to. So I'm going to go ahead and just select, let's say, Twitter demo, and I'm going to click Next. On this page, we're going to connect to a cognitive service. So the Azure Cognitive Services are a number of machine learning services that users can utilize inside their applications that do things like textual analytics, and in this particular case, we'll be using it for sentiment. And you have a choice of either using existing cognitive service, so you can input your existing cognitive key, and as a general recommendation, if you have many different templates or many different applications that all utilize sentiment, we would recommend spinning up one cognitive service and using the same key for all of the different services you'll be using. This particular cognitive service that we spin up has the capacity to do 100,000 API calls a month. So as long as you don't exceed that, it would be a recommended practice to just use one cognitive service key for all your different templates or all your different applications. In this case, I'm going to just go ahead and spin up a new cognitive service. Over here, we need to authenticate against Twitter. So what we're going to do is click Connect to Twitter, and I'm going to be taken to another OAuth page where I can input my Twitter details. And the reason we need your Twitter account is because we need to use this inside the Logic app to actually call Twitter's APIs. This doesn't impact your Twitter account from any sort of monetary perspective. If you are, however, spinning up many different solutions that utilize a Twitter API, you may want to be careful, as there is a limit on how many API calls you can do against Twitter. I think it's 450 every 15 minutes. So if you're utilizing the same login details in lots and lots of different places, you could reach some limits around that. But there's no other impact in terms of your account being used over here. So I'm going to go ahead and click Authorize App. So now we have successfully validated our credentials. We are done with the configuration aspects of the solution. So we're done with connecting to all the different Azure services that we're going to need for the solution. The last two pages are really about customizing your solution to make it specific to your requirements. The first page allows you to customize search terms. So what we mean by search terms are the actual keywords that we use to get data out of Twitter. So as an example, I can go ahead and put in Power BI, and I can validate this to make sure that the box is not empty. So right now, what's going to happen behind the scenes is any tweets that have the term Power BI, it could be in the tweet text, it could be in the author, it could be in the link, are going to be returned to me inside my and passed through the pipeline. On the next page, we ask you for your Twitter handles, and there's a slight distinction between Twitter handles and between search terms. The search terms, as I've said, are the ones that actually go out to Twitter, and we find all of the tweets that contain your search term. Once we actually start processing the tweets, we use the Twitter handles to see if we can figure out a tweet's direction. So if I go ahead and put in @MSPowerBI and validate this, this is going to look at every tweet that comes through the funnel, and it's going to try and figure out whether MS Power BI is an account that is mentioned in any shape or form in that tweet. So for example, if I am MS Power BI and I tweet something, we will figure out, hey, this is an outbound tweet that is being tweeted by Power BI. If someone is tweeting and using @PowerBI in the tweet text, we can figure out that that's an inbound tweet. It's being tweeted @PowerBI. And to really understand where we use this particular data, if we navigate back to the reports for a second, we will see that, for example, here, page 2 is our inbound tweet page. We can see that the accounts we follow is MS Power BI and Power BI, and we can see the tweet direction over here. So if we navigate and let's say click this particular bar graph, which is the inbound tweets, we will see all of these tweets that are being tweeted at MS Power BI. Similarly, if we go to the outbound page, which is the first page, you will see that all of, let's say, the retweet of outbound tweets, you will see these are all the tweets where people are retweeting Power BI's tweets because they are a retweet of an outbound tweet, so a retweet of a Power BI tweet. And we will go into tweet directions in a little bit more detail later on in this training. I can now click next, and I am on a summary page. This shows me all of the details that I've gone ahead and inputted. And when I'm happy with everything, I can click run. And this basically deploys the solution template. And this will take about 3 to 5 minutes to run. You can see all of the different steps that we are running over here. If we zoom into this a little bit, first step is to deploy all the SQL scripts that we run. And we'll go through the data model in a little bit more detail as well. We then go ahead and deploy the cognitive service, and we get the cognitive service key. The reason we actually need the cognitive service key physically is because we pass this key into our Azure function as a parameter so that we are able to use the cognitive services and get the sentiment of tweets. And I'll show you that once we start going through the Azure function. We then deploy the Twitter function and we validate that it has been created correctly. And we actually, what we mean by deploying Twitter function assets is we deploy the script of the function itself. So the first step, we deploy the Azure resource, and then step 7, we deploy the script that we've written that's in C# code. We then deploy a Twitter logic app and we validate the logic app. But you'll notice there's 2 steps where we deploy and validate logic apps. Now, the reason there are 2 separate steps is in the first case, we deploy something we call a historical logic app. So we want the users to start with some data already inside their reports. We don't want the reports to be completely empty. So what we are able to do is we deploy a one-off logic app and we run it once, which is this step number 10, run logic app historical, which gets some historical data. We precisely get a maximum of 100 historical tweets that have been tweeted in the past week. We then never use that logic app again. We only then deploy a new logic app which does the current tweets and finds us tweets in real time and brings them in through the pipeline as the tweets come through. And these are all the steps that we basically do for this particular solution template. And once this is done running, we will end up with a Power BI report file. And this report file will look in terms of the visualizations and sort of the pages exactly the same as the reports that you've seen me demo earlier on today. So the reports are exactly the same. So we'll just wait another second for this configuration to all be done and deployed. And I will show you just very briefly how you go about connecting to your data inside the Power BI report. And then we're going to actually look at the resource group that we've created and all of the different resources that have been spun up on the Azure subscription. So you can actually see what constitutes a solution, the Twitter solution template. So let's go ahead and click download PBIX. And we're going to go ahead and save this. Let's view our downloads and let's go ahead and open this. So you'll notice we have a cover page to start out the template. Over here, we tell you how you actually go about connecting to your data. We don't want to get into the business of passing credentials between the installer and between Power BI. We don't store any of that information, so you still have to connect physically to your Azure SQL again once you've set everything up. And the way you do that is if you go into Edit Queries. In my case, it has actually cached my details, so I don't have to log in again. But if you go ahead and start out with a new Azure SQL that you've not used Power BI with before, you will get an Edit Credentials button over here. And then if I go into data source settings and edit permissions, this is going to mimic the exact same box you would get if you clicked on edit credentials. So you need to make sure you're set on the database tab over here, not on the Windows tab, on the database tab. And please put in the username and the password that you used when you put in your Azure SQL details. And click on Save. And you should be able to then see your data coming through. You can close and apply your changes, and that's going to bring in the new Twitter data that you've set up. And if we give this a couple of seconds, we should be able to start seeing some data already coming through because we have this historical functionality in. So if I go to something like, let's say, the author hashtag page, we can see data coming in about Power BI. So this is sort of the starting point. This is what you should start seeing when you first set up the template. We are now going to take a look at the resources that we have spun up. I have now navigated to the Azure portal, and I'm going to go ahead and navigate to my resource groups to find the container that we created when we were spinning up the solution template. As I look down, I can find Training Video Twitter, which is the name of the resource group we used. Inside the Training Video Twitter resource group, we can see all of the different resources that we have spun up. And we will go through these resources one by one to find out what exactly are we doing with the Twitter template behind the scenes. Let's start with the cognitive service. When we navigated to cognitive service, we actually see the cognitive service that we have spun up. One potential area of interest could be keys. That is where we actually see the full key for the cognitive service that we spun up. And if you ever want to reuse the same key versus solution template, you would just go into here and copy the key that you find here. Another potential interesting area may be the pricing tier. Over here, you can change the tier of your cognitive service and use a different one if you would like. So first of all, you can actually see for the textual analytics cognitive service, these are all the different services that you can use. We are mostly using sentiment analysis, but you could also be doing things like key phrase extraction, topic detection, and language detection. As a default, we set the solution template to use the S1, which is the 100,000 calls per 30 days. However, you can go ahead and change the cognitive service if you would like to be using a different tier. For example, if you know that you're going to be creating solutions that require a much higher volumes, you could go ahead and look at the 500K. You can also just try things out and switch things over to the free tier, but you're only allowed one of these per Azure subscription. If you ever want to learn more about pricing, either for the cognitive service or for any other Azure service, you can navigate to the pricing calculator on the Azure website. This is really helpful for figuring out and estimating how much approximately your solution is going to cost. So I've inputted cognitive service over here, and you can choose the instance, and you can learn about how much transactions are going to cost you. But you can go ahead and add any other items and price things out and package things up to figure out how much everything is going to cost. Next resource I wanted to look at is the Logic app. Now, the Logic app is a really important component. This is the component that actually pulls data from Twitter and pushes it through to the Azure function to do the enrichments on top of the data. So we can see that things are running. We can see that our runs are successful. And if you ever want to find out more about runs, you can just click on a run and wait for the flow to load, and you can actually see the status code over here. So if anything ever fails, you can diagnose what's going on over here. But let's actually take a look at what the Logic app looks like. So I just clicked on edit, and this takes me to the designer for Logic apps. So you can see the Logic app is very simple. It's a very simple business workflow. When a new tweet appears with the search text, so this is from the search terms page when we were setting up the solution template, we see it's Power BI. Please go ahead and run this function. This is basically what this business workflow is saying. And you can do some slight tweaks over here. So if you want to ever change the search text, you can go and make changes over here. You can also go ahead and set the frequency for how often you would like this to run. So you can see you can set it to a day, hour, minute, or even second interval, and you can set the interval over here. As a default, we set it to every 3 minutes. You can go ahead and make it as frequent as you like or as rare as you like. Our general recommendation is if you are using a search term that's not very popular, you probably want to make that interval larger. So you want it to run less frequently because every time this action runs, so every 3 minutes, it does cost per action. So if you know you're not going to be collecting many tweets, you probably want to make it a little bit more rare to run. However, if you know you're looking for something super popular, there is currently a limit on the Logic app, so you can return 100 tweets every time this runs. So if you know you're going to be returning 100 tweets regularly, you can make that interval a little bit smaller as well. You can also change the connection. So if you want to go ahead and change which user you are logged in as, you can go ahead and click on Add New Connection, and that's going to redirect you to the authentication page. And I can go ahead and change the user over here. If you do end up changing the search terms that you see over here, it is very important to familiarize yourself with the Twitter Search API to know how to input these queries correctly. If, for example, I wanted to look for anything in a tweet that contained either the word Power BI or Azure, I would have to type in or uppercase Azure like this. And the best way to get yourself familiar is if you go ahead and actually go into the Twitter Search API documentation, find out how to build a query, and see all the different operators and what exactly that operator translates to. So if you want to look for one word or another word, if you want to have an exclusion word, if you only want to look for a specific hashtag or for a specific account, you can learn more about what operators actually mean over here and translate those into the Logic App Designer. The next resource in the list is the storage account, which is this one over here. Now, we don't actually do much with the storage account from a solution template perspective. We spin it up because the Azure function has a dependency on it. So when we spin up the Azure function, we spin up a storage account along with it. And the Azure function uses the storage account to do its logging. So if you ever are interested in the logging that is being done by the Azure function, you can explore the storage account, but we're not going to cover this in this particular video. The next resource after that is the Twitter API connection. So I was showing you this inside the Logic app when I needed to authenticate to a Twitter account as the first step. So this is actually the physical connection that we have for the Twitter API. And again, we're not going to cover this in much detail. The next resource in the list is our app service plan, and we're also not going to cover this in a huge amount of detail. All you need to know about this is whenever you spin up a function, it comes with an app service plan, and we use something called a dynamic app service plan. So what this means is this is directly related to consumption. So however much you consume the Azure function, that is how much you're going to be charged. We do not use any kind of tiers. We just use a dynamic service plan. And if you ever want to find out more about this, again, go into your pricing calculator in Azure and you can see the different types of plans that are available. But you can see over here we have pricing tier dynamic. The final resource in the list is the Azure function. And we're going to spend quite a lot of time on this because there's a lot of things to point out with the Azure function. An Azure function basically allows us to run some code in the cloud. And you can choose from a lot of different languages. In this case, we are using C# for this particular function. And you'll see this is the landing page for the Azure function. Inside our function app, we have one function running, which is the tweet processing function. And we're going to take a second to wait for this to load. Before jumping into the script, I would like to just take you guys through one other section, the integrate section. So this is how you actually build up the building blocks of an Azure function. You need to have a trigger, which basically triggers the running of your function. And we'll see over here we actually have a webhook trigger and we have a request parameter. Another important area you would may be interested in is the function app settings. And inside the function app settings, you have something, you can actually go to the detailed settings. And what you actually see over here are all of the different keys that we save for you. So if I go to application settings over here, and I scroll down, you will see we have our connection string and a subscription key, which are hidden for security reasons. And the first one is our SQL database connection string. So this is a connection string we'll be referencing inside the Azure Function whenever we want to connect to SQL. And the subscription key is the subscription key for our cognitive service. So whenever we want to use the cognitive service, we'll be referencing this particular key. But we don't want to pass these keys in the raw text of the function due to security reasons, so we save them here as connection strings. So let's navigate back into our function and actually take a look at what the function does. So at the top, we are loading in all the packages that we need for this particular function to run. And then we get to our first run method. So the run method basically reads the tweet and all of its metadata. It reads it in, from the request that is sent by the logic app, and it parses this information. And you can also see it actually saves the connection string needed for connecting to SQL over here in a variable. If I carry on scrolling down, we see the tweet handle class. This is where all of the methods that we basically use for the function are situated. And we also have all of the dictionary definitions for the SQL tables that we will be saving. And we're going to go through the data model in a little bit of detail after this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the structure of all of these different dictionaries that we use. But just know that these are there to as placeholders for once we save the data into SQL. So the first method I wanted to talk about in more detail is the parse tweet method. So what we do inside here is we parse the tweet and all the metadata at the very beginning, and then we read in the Twitter handles and Twitter handle IDs from SQL. Now, these Twitter handles are the Twitter handles that we saved back in the setup experience on the Twitter handle page. If you remember back, or if you want to scroll back in the video, you'll see that is where I typed in @MS-Power-BI. Now, the reason we do this is because we need to figure out the tweet direction. If you scroll back to the reports, you'll see at the very top on the outbound and inbound page, we talked about being able to look at all the tweets that are being tweeted by Power BI, or all the tweets that people are tweeting at Power BI. This is where we figure out this logic. And the first step we have to do is we bring in the Twitter handles from the SQL table. We also bring in the Twitter handle IDs, and you might be thinking, well, we never actually saved the IDs, so how do I know what an ID is? Every single Twitter handle in Twitter has a corresponding ID to it. And there are websites you can find online if you type in find Twitter ID, where you basically are able to type in the Twitter handle and you see what the Twitter ID is. So you can do this manually, but behind the scenes, we actually just do an API call when you type in the Twitter handle. So when you click on the validate button in our installer, it takes a few seconds, but programmatically can figure out the handle ID. But you can also do this manually if you ever want to change these, and we'll go through this exactly how you do this in the customization section. So we read in the Twitter handle and the Twitter handle ID from our Azure SQL database, and we save them in a dictionary. The next thing we do is we check the language of the tweet. So this is just metadata that's attached to the tweet. So we pull out the lang tab and we figure out whether it's in English, French, Spanish, or Portuguese. Those are the languages that the cognitive service supports. And if we find a language that is supported by the cognitive service, we pass it through the sentiment analysis API. So we make a sentiment request call over here. And I'm not going to go through every single method in this function, so I'm just going to go through the main kind of logic, and you can explore this code in more detail once you set up the solution up yourself. But we make the call to get the sentiment out, and we save it in the sentiment string. And then we just add some additional enrichments. We figure out, for example, whether given the sentiment, whether it's below 0, above 0, or equal to 0, and we save it in the appropriate kind of categorical variable. So we say it's positive, negative, or neutral. We also create buckets so that you're able to look at sentiment by, let's say, a sentiment that's between 0.2 and 0.3. And the scale that we use over here ranges from -1 being the most negative, 0 being neutral, and +1 being the most positive. And we go ahead and we save all of the sentiment into the dictionary. If we don't recognize the sentiment, we just save it in an undefined tag. Now the next bulk of the code works out the actual tweet direction. And we do two things. Firstly, we figure out whether a tweet is a retweet or if it's not a retweet. And depending on whether it's a retweet or not a retweet, we capture that information. And what we basically do through this code, and again, I'm not going to go through all the different methods, is we figure out where the account that we're interested in. So for example, we're interested in MS Power BI. We figure out where we can see MS Power BI within the tweet body and within all the metadata surrounding the tweet. So for example, if I find that the author of the tweet is MS Power BI and I match it with what's in my dictionary, which is MS Power BI, I know this is an outbound tweet. And I am able to save this information as the tweet direction and say this is an outbound tweet. So again, I encourage you guys to get familiar with and look at how this code actually works. It's just really a lot of if statements to see, do I see MS Power BI in the author? Do I see it in the text? Do I see it in a hashtag? Do I see it in an @ And depending on where basically we see MS Power BI, that is where we go ahead and save the tweet direction. We then go ahead and save what we call original tweets into SQL. And by original tweet, we mean not a retweet. So if we've seen this tweet before, we do not save it into SQL because we do not need to save the same tweet text 20 times if it's the same tweet over and over. We only need to save it once. We do, however, have another table called processed tweets. And here we do actually save the retweets and all the other metadata that we find. So for example, we save things like the timestamp. So even if it's a retweet of the same tweet, the timestamp will be different for every tweet. It'll have a unique tweet ID. The author will be different. We save things like how many followers does this author have, how many times did that author favorite things. So we save a bunch of metadata. Along with media metadata as well. So we look at things like whether we can see an image on the tweet and we save the image URL. And we take all of this information and we save it in the processed tweets table. So again, we'll go into more detail around the data model just after this section where I will cover more explicitly what's the difference between processed tweets and what's the difference between original tweets. Carrying on, we basically spend the rest of this code populating different tables within the data model. So we populate a hashtag slicer table, we populate an author hashtag network table, and there's a couple of tables that we basically save all the data that we collected into. And that's basically the end of the script. You'll see all of the other helper methods over here where we actually do the execution of the SQL query. We actually generate the SQL query. We have our sentiment call. But again, I wanted to use this video to go through the general logic of what the script does rather than outline every single method in a lot of detail. But if you do want to dive deep into the code, please go ahead and, this code is going to be deployed every time you run this function, so you can go ahead and mess around with it and see how things work over here. So this wraps up all of the Azure resources I wanted to go through today. We went through the cognitive service, the logic app, in a lot of depth. We skimmed through the storage account, the Twitter API connection, and the app service plan, and then we covered the Azure function. Before jumping into the data model, I just wanted to go through the concept of a tweet direction in a little bit more detail. And in order to do that, I'm going to navigate into our GitHub. This is our documentation. And you'll see while I documented the function, there's actually a section that's explicitly dedicated to the direction of a tweet. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but you can navigate to this GitHub documentation and actually see what each tweet direction means. So we have many different tweet directions. We've talked about inbound and outbound tweets quite a lot in this video, but there's actually quite a few more. There's inbound retweets, there's outbound replies, there's hashtag retweets, there's retweets of text. So I would encourage you to familiarize yourself what each tweet direction actually means by navigating to the documentation for the GitHub. There will be a link posted to this documentation underneath the YouTube video, and actually understand what each of these means as you encounter them inside the reports. So the next thing I wanted to go through in a little bit of detail is the actual data model. So let's jump back into Power BI and let's actually take a look at the data model that we have in place. And while taking you through a function, I talked briefly about the original tweets and the processing tweets table. And I wanted to talk more about the distinction between those two tables here. The original tweet table is the table where we store every individual tweet. So again, there are no retweets here. If I tweet something and 20 people retweet it, the tweet text will be saved once in here. So we see tweet, that's the actual tweet text, and then we have things like the sentiment stored in this table as well, because sentiment does not change in the same tweet. If I tweet once and 20 people retweet it, the sentiment will always stay the same. So we only save it once. And then we also have the master ID. And this is how we join our processing tweets, which in the Power BI file is just called tweets. We join on the master ID. So it's a one-to-many relationship. So if we have 20 retweets, the master ID in the tweets table will be repeated 20 times, but we have a unique tweet ID. So over here, every single tweet and retweet is stored. We store things like the author, we store the how many followers this author has, how many times they favorited things, what the timestamp was, so all sorts of things about that particular tweet. We then have a number of different tables that join onto the tweets table on the tweet ID. So here again, each tweet ID is unique and we have a one-to-many relationship with these four tables. The author mention graph and the author hashtag graph go hand in hand. So let's just remind ourselves, if we go back into the report and we go to the author hashtag graph, that table basically stores the structure for this particular graph. And this graph is looking at hashtags and it's looking at authors. You could also construct the same sort of graph with mentions. So anytime someone uses the @ symbol, and that's where the author mention graph information is stored. So if you want to create a network graph but use mentions instead of hashtags, use this table. We then also have a hashtag slicer and a mention slicer. If we go back again into the reports for a second, and let's go into the pivoting overview, whenever we have these slicers that look for hashtags, we are basically using this table. So let me just click this, you'll see hashtag slicer is chosen, and this is basically, the facet is the hashtag itself, and the tweet ID basically is what we join on. So if we go back to this, you can do the same thing both for mentions, so @ symbols and hashtags. Finally, we have a disconnected table over here, which is called minimum tweets. And what this basically is used for is it's actually used on the sentiment page. So what we have on the sentiment page is this measure over here. And if I click on, let's say 5, what this will do is it will cross-filter the graphs and show me only tweets that have a count of 5 or higher. So what does that actually mean? Well, if we look at count of tweets by author, we filter out any tweets or actually we filter out any authors who have tweeted less than 5 tweets. Similarly here, we filter out any hashtags that have less than 5 tweets. So let's just set a minimum bar for how many tweets we want to see on the page. And this basically wraps up the data model that we wanted to go through today. Another important topic I wanted to touch on is customizations. And in the context of the Twitter template, a really important customization is changing the search words, changing the keywords that you want to track for Twitter. And there are 2 things that need to be done to correctly alter the keywords if you want the reports to look absolutely correct. So the first one we went through in some detail already, but I want to just explicitly call it out again. I'm back inside the Azure portal and I'm going to navigate back into my Logic app. And inside the Logic app, I'm going to go ahead and edit it again inside the designer. And imagine I want to change my keywords so I'm not only looking for Power BI, but also, let's say I want to look for Power Apps. Well, all I have to do is I need to go into this first step when a new tweet appears and change it from Power BI or Power Apps. And this is basically, I then just click Save, and this changes the keywords. So now whenever my Logic app runs every 3 minutes, it's not only going to return me tweets that have the Power BI keyword inside, but if there's a tweet it finds that has the word Power Apps inside, it'll return those as well. So this is the first step. But we actually also have to do a second change. And let me explain why. In this first step, we are changing our funnel. We are changing which tweets come into our funnel. However, I am not looking for Power Apps inside my tweet direction. So if I look at my outbound tweets or if I look at my inbound tweets, it will still only show me Power BI. Now imagine I also wanted to look for the Power Apps account. Well, I actually have to change the accounts that get brought into my function. If you remember, inside the function, we bring in the accounts from SQL and change them into a dictionary and check the tweet direction there. So the change needs to be made inside SQL. So let's go ahead and go into SQL Server Management Studio. And you'll see over here, we've got PBIS_Twitter. All of these tables are from the Twitter solution template, and we've gone through these tables already in the data model. We've gone through hashtag graph, mention graph, slicer, mention slicer, tweets normalized, tweets processed. There's one table we haven't touched though yet, which is this configuration table. So let me just bring this up again. And you'll notice here we have the Twitter handle and the Twitter handle ID. And this is the table that the Azure function uses to bring in our handle and our handle ID. Now, again, we talked about the fact that we don't actually figure out we don't actually input the handle ID inside the experience. This is something we figure out programmatically. So if I wanted to add Power Apps, and I went ahead and edited this table, all I would need to do is inside Twitter handle, I would go ahead and edit this, put a comma, no spaces, and put in Power Apps. Then I still have to figure out the ID. So in order to figure out the ID, let's go back over here. Let's open a new browser. I'm going to a page called twitterid.com. Now, there are many different pages like this online. You can just look for Find Twitter ID, and it will basically give you a list of pages that you can use. But Twitter ID is a good one, where I can just type in Power Apps, and that's going to go ahead and convert my Power Apps account into the ID. And I can just copy that from the browser, go back to SQL Server Management Studio, put a comma, and paste this, and click Enter. And now, basically, if I select this table again, select top 1000, you will see I've got MS Power BI, comma, Power Apps. I've got the ID for MS Power BI, comma, the ID for Power Apps. Now, whenever my Azure function runs and it reads in these values from SQL, it'll also read in Power Apps, it'll read in this ID, and it will also check the tweet direction for Power Apps as well. And these are the two changes you have to make. One is inside the Logic app and one is inside your SQL configuration table in order to change the keywords that you are looking for. The final part before wrapping up is just touching lightly on pricing. So I've now navigated onto our GitHub page. This is a GitHub page any of you can access. It's got all of the documentation that you will need for the template. And the last section is a section on pricing. I'm not going to go through the pricing in great details. I just want to cover some basic facts, and you can go and find out more using the Azure pricing calculator. The parts I did want to cover, though, is we differentiate our costs for the function with fixed costs and variable costs. The fixed cost is no matter how many tweets you'll be processing, you'll be paying these costs every month. So to start with, we spin up an Azure SQL Standard Edition, which is about $30 a month, and we spin up the Cognitive Services, which is $150 a month. These costs are actually broken down to daily costs. So if you spin something up and you spin it down after 3 days, you'll just pay for the 3-day usage rather than the full month's usage. You can go ahead and change these afterwards to meet your specific requirements. So for example, if you want to just use a basic SQL, you could go ahead and go into your Azure service and change it from an S1 to a basic one. The other costs, which are the Logic App costs and the Azure Function costs, are really dependent on the number of tweets you're processing every month. So we have some approximate costs. These do take into consideration the fixed costs as well. So to process 10,000 tweets that cost about $210. To process 100,000, that would cost about $385. And again, you can go into the Azure calculator and figure out how much your Logic App is going to cost you per action. The Logic App has 2 actions, so you have to take both into consideration, which is, the first one is the when a tweet appears, and the second one is passing the data into the function itself. The function is done on a consumption perspective, so it looks at how much compute power you use. And the functions are run very quickly. They usually run in less than a second per call. So again, you can work out those approximates if you would like to get a more specific idea of pricing. So with that, I'd like to wrap up the training for the Twitter template. If you have any questions that are not covered in this training material, please scroll down into the details of the YouTube video. We have our team alias there, so you can email us with any additional questions. Thanks a lot.